Pakistan is the paradise of the Islamists. When Islamists want to perceive, to feel what their heaven on earth is like, they go to Pakistan. Pakistan means the land of the pure. Their constitution is the Quran. Their law is the Sharia. Christians in Pakistan have the same rights as dogs. In Pakistan, for example, if people think that some Christians have spoken ill of the Prophet, they haven't praised him enough, they can accuse them of blasphemy, and hopefully they will go to trial. Many times they do not reach the trial because the Muslims themselves arrest them, lynch them, or kill them. In the case of Asia Bibi, we were very concerned. There is an anti-blasphemy law in Pakistan that provides for prison sentences for Pakistani citizens who blaspheme against the Prophet Muhammad. But what struck us most was that the death penalty was being considered. And we were also greatly surprised by the circumstances surrounding the Asia Bibi case. A Christian woman, a mother who was working in the fields near Lahore in a small village, suddenly confronted by two sisters, two Muslim women who essentially, once Asia Bibi offered them to drink from a bucket of water, they said they would not drink because it had been contaminated by having been touched by Asia Bibi herself, who is a Christian. The case was especially irritating because she was a simple countrywoman who had gone with a group of friends to the well, who was fetching water, had had a little conflict of cohabitation, and as a consequence of that conflict, she was accused of blasphemy unjustly, illegitimately, illegally, because there was no such blasphemy, and as a consequence of that, she has spent 6 years on death row. That is outrageous.
So I became more aware of her case, more knowledgeable about the background, what exactly she was being charged with, that sort of thing. And from then, it's been pretty much constant involvement over the last 4 or 5 years. Lots of petitions in her defense, communications with her family, fundraising on her behalf to pay for her legal defense.
We at that time studied here internally what we could do. We got in touch with a Polish association, a Christian association in the Silesians environment, who had started to make a documentary film about the case of Asia Bibi to let the whole world know what this Christian woman had been suffering. And it turned out that they lacked funding. So we immediately asked for donations to CitizenGO members all over the world. We got the funding, we helped them to shoot the film, we even traveled to Pakistan with a group of people from this association who finished the film. Asia Bibi has become an icon of the defense of religious freedom. That is what seems to me most relevant. That she has become an icon for us, for those who defend religious freedom. Unfortunately, it has also become an icon for those radical Islamists who defend the Sharia in all its harshness, in all its demands, and in all its cruelty, including the law that criminalizes alleged blasphemy. We contacted the family of Asia Bibi through the person who had been helping her husband and daughters, Yosef Nadim. And in Pakistan, we were able to meet Asia Bibi's husband, Asik, and the daughters of Asia Bibi. We saw the house where they lived, the school that had taken the father as a school worker so that he could earn his living, and also met the daughters as students in the school. Both Yosef Nadim and the lawyers handling her case, whom we met, explained to us that the best chance Asia Bibi had of escaping Pakistan alive was making her case known by the greatest number of people in the world, particularly in the West, so that there would be a groundswell of public opinion that would put pressure on Western governments to demand that the Pakistani government respect human rights. Christians in Pakistan live in ghettos. The Pakistani authorities do not call these ghettos, they call them colonies. We visited St. Joseph's colony, St. Joseph's ghetto, shortly after the Christians returned to live there. It had happened that a boy living in the ghetto had been accused by a Muslim hairdresser of having despised the Prophet Muhammad. Then groups of Muslims entered the ghetto, persecuted and attacked the Christians who lived there, ransacked their homes, set fire to the ghetto, and razed it to the ground. Of course, the ambulances, the police, the firemen arrived late. No one was ever arrested or charged for the assault on the St. Joseph ghetto. We happened to be there when the Christians had started to return to the ghetto. We could see that the Christians lived in those ghettos. They lived in neighborhoods where there were no Muslims, neighborhoods where you could see their extreme poverty, where no streets were paved, where there was no sewage system. People threw their waste into the streets. We saw how Christians were marginalized and kept confined. The Christians in Pakistan, as we could see, are structurally discriminated against. What impressed me most of all was that after 2 or 3 years after that neighborhood had been burned down, virtually every house in that neighborhood above the door had a Christian cross and sometimes a few words in Arabic to identify themselves as Christians. That's to say that these people were not only not afraid, or perhaps they were but could overcome their fear, but also wanted to give public testimony of their faith. With this, they were also telling the radical Muslims that they would never convert to Islam and that they were capable of suffering the consequences and opposing these violent people who wished to attack or even kill them. Altogether, it was a very strong experience. We collaborated with some Polish people and made a final report, a film called Asia Bibi. That's a film that was recorded and translated into several languages, and we distributed through our social networks. It has had a huge impact. Also in the film, there are many details that, from a judicial point of view, were important, because the key witnesses allowed to decide on Asia Bibi's death sentence did not say in the documentary what they said in the trial, which means that at some point they lied. They most likely lied at the trial. It's the country where, for drinking from a fountain or not praising enough the Prophet Muhammad, they can condemn a person to death, as was the case of Asia Bibi. We helped to finance her legal defense so that, at least, even if the law was unjust, it could be done with all the guarantees. We found there were false witnesses, bought witnesses, made-up evidence, etc. These fakes were the key element within the appeal to Pakistan's Supreme Court that allowed the release of Asia Bibi. International pressure has been the key element that has allowed the government of Pakistan to dare to confront the most radical Islamist groups. In particular, a radical Islamist political party that organized the revolts and put a price on her head. Some of the mullahs and most radical religious leaders of Islam associated with this party issued a fatwa against Asia Bibi. They promised immediate salvation to any Muslim who killed Asia Bibi. That's why her life has always been in danger.
I think politicians listen when their constituents are concerned about an issue, and I think that CitizenGO was a tool for citizens from the United States and from around the world to tell international leaders that they were concerned about this case. They're concerned about the blasphemy laws in Pakistan, but more so they were concerned about the personal story of Asia Bibi, a mother, a wife who's been put in jail for nothing, essentially, for her Christian faith. Because she was a Christian, she was put in jail. And I think the fact that CitizenGO was making leaders aware of that had a huge impact on the case and had a huge impact in raising awareness about her situation.
This international pressure led the government of Pakistan to put Asia Bibi in a high-security prison in an isolation cell where she would not mix with other prisoners. They did this essentially because they wanted to protect her life. They knew that if Asia Bibi was killed in the prison, governments around the world would blame the government of Pakistan. Around the world, Pakistan would have been perceived as a third world country which is not able to control or protect one of its citizens, in our case, Asia Bibi. When we made contact with the husband and with the daughters of Asia Bibi through Yosef Nadim, the first thing we did was to award Asia Bibi one of the At-Tewir yearly awards for having remained faithful to her faith. In prison, they proposed Asia Bibi to convert to Islam and immediately release her from prison. She denied it, saying that she was a Christian. It seemed to us an example of courage, the example of a mother unjustly condemned by a law that attacks religious freedom. We invited Asia Bibi's husband to come and collect the prize in Madrid. That was our first personal contact we had with Asia Bibi's family. We organized the Congress of Persecuted Christians, where the protagonists are the persecuted Christians themselves who tell their testimony. The first was here in Madrid and coincided with this award ceremony. The second Congress was in New York, and a part of that Congress was held inside the United Nations.
CitizenGO organized in April of 2016 an event at the United Nations. The event was intended to raise awareness about Christian persecution, and Asia Bibi's husband, Ashik, and his daughter, Esham, were able to come to the United Nations to speak on her behalf, to raise awareness about her case, and to ask delegates at the United Nations to act on her behalf, to ask the Pakistani government to release her. The event went very well. It was very well received by the community at the United Nations. This is an issue that they care about. It's an issue that we can agree with the United Nations about, that religious freedom is something that should be defended and that Christians should not be put in jail for their faith. So we were able to bring her in front of delegates at the United Nations, asking them to act on her behalf, but we also were able to raise media awareness and to give a personal touch to the event because it was her daughter and her husband at the event.
We have also helped to raise awareness and to make this reality accessible to the media. There have been many media outlets that have had the opportunity to interview the father and some of the daughters of Asia Bibi. But the most important thing has been our fundraising to help support the family and their legal defense.
So they were able to communicate that she's not just a face, she's not just a story, she's a person, a human being who is put in jail because of this. And I think for me personally, meeting her daughter, Isham, at the event, it really increased my determination in her case exponentially, because her daughter is very sweet, very kind. At the event, she was constantly asking to play with my baby, who I had with me at the time, to hold him, to play with him. And you could tell that she had been raised by a loving and caring mother and family. And seeing that, seeing her, increased my desire to see her mother freed, because I couldn't even imagine if my mother, at the age of 10, was put in jail, was taken away from me, and I didn't know when or if I would ever see her again.
We accompanied them to Rome. They had a meeting with the Pope. In short, we provided human accompaniment. On another occasion, we wanted to invite them to another Congress of persecuted Christians in Madrid. But before arriving in Madrid, we stopped in Rome and they exchanged a few words with the Pope. He encouraged them, both Ashik and Isham, and I think that was another important element in that campaign, that great campaign that CitizenGO launched.
Tonight, Asia Bibi arrives in Canada.
The whole process has been like the birth of the mountains because it's been such a long process. The date for the judgment of the Supreme Court was being gradually postponed, supposedly because there had been an illness or indisposition of some of the judges. But what actually happened was that there was a brutal pressure from radical Islamists. These radicals had said that if Asia Bibi was declared innocent, she would be killed in the streets. That's how they verbalized it. There was also a lot of pressure from the West, mainly from the U.S., on Pakistan to listen. If they wanted to receive development aid, they would have to provide reasonable security to their citizens in a reasonable country. There were also several Islamic imams who signed a document in defense of religious freedom, etc. All this went on for several months. Finally, the judgment was taken. We lived and went through it with great joy. After so many years, we had taken up the subject from the beginning. 6, 7 years of fighting, of raising awareness, of taking the family to the media, of interviewing with the Pope, of putting advertisements in the newspapers, etc. Finally, the news for which we had fought for so many years had happened. It had been an unjust law with an unjust trial, but finally liberation had been achieved. You can imagine what a joy it was for the whole team that had been involved in the case. Also for millions of people to whom we had raised awareness, as we had been informing them step by step about everything that had been happening. They had been sharing our same suffering, our same anguish, but also in this case, our same joy.
Obviously, that's our hope and our prayer, is that this would open the door to changing the laws in Pakistan and to changing the laws around the world. Freedom of religion is a human right, but it's a human right that's not being respected in a lot of countries. And I think that raising awareness about her particular situation opened that door for a wider discussion about this case, about these anti-blasphemy laws that are in Middle Eastern countries and in many places around the world. It's not just Pakistan. And I think in the end, our hope is that it will eventually change the laws in the more short term. We haven't necessarily seen a lot of movement in that direction. I think the government is still very cautious of radicals and extremists and backlash from changing the laws, but I certainly think it was a step in the right direction, and we're hoping that we will continue to take steps towards that.
But just after her release, we faced another threat for quite some time because the radical Islamists had threatened that they would kill her if she were taken out of prison. So, the first few days of her release, she was kept inside the prison. Despite being legally and judicially free, she was still in prison, safer than outside. Once out of jail, she had been kept safe somewhere in Islamabad, in the capital. There she remained for many months, isolated of course, unable to go outside. At least she was no longer in prison. In that safe place, she had been able to join her husband. Several months later, she took a plane, when nobody in Pakistan was aware and the radical Islamists were not so watchful, and she was able to fly out to a Western country where she reunited with her family, and where she is now, again, confined, because she does not dare to go out to the streets, as there are radical Islamists and Pakistanis who could recognize her anywhere in the world. Fortunately, the outcome has been a happy one. She is now reunited with her family. She lives in a free country. She can pray freely to her God. That is what we are fighting for at CitizenGO to happen all over the world, to all the Asia Bibis. Asia Bibi has been the icon that generated awareness, that has generated mobilization. But unfortunately, she's not the only one. There are many Asia Bibis in the world, not only in Pakistan, but also in Nigeria and other countries. I think one of the main unresolved issues in the world is the issue of religious freedom. I think that what we have to do is to continue to mobilize, to continue to talk about these cases, and to continue to put pressure on our governments to intercede, to take an interest in these Christians who are suffering religious persecution, particularly in those countries where it is the police that persecute the Christians for exercising their religious freedom and rights.